You spent months, sometimes years, working on your first draft, all the while consuming every piece of writing advice you could find. Yet, your story never quite reaches the level of best-selling novels, does it? That's because these authors plot differently to what you've been taught. First of all, they make sure that all their characters feel the same, they make sure their protagonist doesn't have a goal, and they make sure their story runs on two plots at once. I know. Let me show you. If you're new here, hi, my name is Julian, creator of the Story Pillars Method. It's a storytelling framework based on best-selling novels to help you write a first draft that is not gonna take you years of endless revision. So if you're writing a novel, don't forget to subscribe. And if you've been a friend of the channel, then you'll be pleased to know that we'll be using a bunch of new examples today. There will be timestamps down below, so feel free to skip ahead if there are parts of the method that you already master. All right, so what do I mean by best-selling authors make sure that all their characters feel the same? What they do is give all of the characters in the story, so I mean protagonist, antagonist, and any other secondary character, the same shared foundation. And in the Story Pillars method, we call this the common denominator. This common denominator is made up of two things, and the first one is the moral need. Now, you may have come across this term in John Truby's Anatomy of Story, where he defines it as a moral weakness that the protagonist needs to overcome. He's not wrong, but as you study best-selling novels, you realize that actually is not that protagonist-centric. In fact, what you'll see is that every characters wrestle with the same moral question, just from a different angle. The second component is the psychological need, which is the internal barrier that stops each character from acting on the moral need. And best-selling authors don't come up with psychological needs at random. They drew from what we call the emotion triad, three core emotions that psychology identifies as the primary blockers of change and growth. So you have guilt, shame, and anger. The psychological need of your story should revolve around one of those three. And if you need help choosing between them, I made a series on this. I link it below, so make sure to check it out later. So just to recap before we get to the examples, the moral need is what the story is asking every character to learn, and the psychological need is the reason they can't or haven't done so when the story begins. All right, so if you look at Pride and Prejudice, for example, the moral need of the story is literally pride and prejudice. Every character holds on to those two things as kind of armor because of their psychological need to confront their shame and face their fear of being exposed or found lacking. In Harry Potter, the question of belonging and worthiness runs through every character. From Voldemort, who builds an entire ideology around blood purity as a way to assert his place in the world, to Hermione, who holds on to knowledge and scholar achievements to justify her presence in a magical world she wasn't born into. In The Handmaid's Tale, a dystopian story set in a totalitarian regime that has hunted and captured fertile women and forced them to bear children for the ruling class, the moral need revolves around complicity. Atwood herself, the author, has spoken about this as the story's central question: how women are being enlisted to control other women, and how the regime works precisely by making people complicit. And the psychological need shared across every character is to confront the shame that already lived within them. Because Gilead, the totalitarian regime, is pretty much a machine that weaponizes shame. So in these stories, even though every character shares the same moral need and the same psychological need, they're still pretty unique and memorable, right? That's because each one of them carries their own psychological wound, something that happened before the story ever began, something that's unique to them, that shapes how the psychological need shows up in their specific life. So they all have the same internal barrier, the same psychological need, but they have different scar tissues, if that makes sense. And the common denominator matters beyond characterization. You'll see exactly why towards the end, so stay with me. Right, what do I mean by your protagonist should not have a goal? Well, when you look at best-selling novels in more depth, you realize that instead of having your protagonist chasing the same goal throughout the story, which is a recipe for a psychic middle, these authors craft two fixations: a minor and a major fixation, each with a very specific purpose. The minor fixation is what drives the first half of your story, and it's also what draws your reader in. It's essentially what your story is advertised to be about. And it's also the vehicle through which you get to show your readers every rule, every detail of the world that you've created. In Harry Potter, the minor fixation is to win the House Cup. And through that pursuit, we learn about Quidditch, the point system, we learn about the rules and the rivalries, everything that makes that world feel real. Then the major fixation, on the other hand, only comes into focus around more or less the midpoint. It's what reignites the momentum of your story, and it's the real reason your readers stays until the very end. So in Harry Potter, this is when the trio figures out about the Philosopher's Stone, and the story pivots towards protecting it and defeating Voldemort. In Pride and Prejudice, the minor fixation is to protect her family's reputation and secure her sister's futures, while the major fixation will be to confront, to come to terms with her own feelings for Mr. Darcy. In The Handmaid's Tale, the minor fixation is to find her daughter who's been held captive somewhere. It's what drives the plotting, her scheming, her will to survive, but the major fixation that eventually takes hold is to take down Gilead itself. And just to throw in one more example, in the Hunger Games, the minor fixation is to survive the games, which, let's be honest, is exactly why people picked up the book in the first place. But the major fixation will be to outwit the Capitol entirely. And that major fixation doesn't just drive the first book, it drives the entire trilogy, which raises a question worth sitting with if you're writing a series. Now, I know that seeing this in well-known stories is one thing, knowing how to do it for your own novel is a different challenge entirely. So if you'd like my help with that, check out the first link in the description down below. All right, so that's the common denominator and the major and minor fixations. Now, the third thing best-selling authors do is make sure that their story runs on two plots at once. And I'm not talking about having an internal journey and an external sequence of events running in parallel. Because if you do that, you're going to struggle a little bit with balance. You'll end up with a first draft that's going to be either too much action or too much introspection with nothing really happening on the surface. There's a reason why best-selling novels have a well-defined common denominator and two separate fixations, because those two will help you intertwine the inner journey with the outer plot at strategic moments throughout the story. That's what we call a dual storyline, and it works a little bit like the two strands of a DNA helix connected at specific points, so when something happens on one track, it creates a ripple effect on the other. And the main strategic connection points are these. The first is the dual inciting incident. Now be careful, this is not your traditional inciting incident. It's called a dual inciting incident because it's made up of two very specific types of inciting incidents: an inciting threat and an inciting opportunity. The inciting opportunity is what you might recognize as the call to adventure, and the inciting threat is what comes before it, foreshadowing it, making it feel inevitable when it arrives. In the Hunger Games, the inciting opportunity is the moment Prim's name, the protagonist's sister, gets picked to be sent to the arena. I don't know about you, but personally, at the time, I didn't see that one coming. I was kind of low-key expecting Katniss to be picked. I mean, she's the protagonist, and yet when you look back, it could only have gone this way because of the inciting threat. You see, in the first few pages, Katniss meets Madge, who is the mayor's daughter, and Katniss notices that this girl is wearing a dress she wouldn't normally wear because she's just turned 12, which is the age tributes normally enter the draw for the first time. And somewhere in between, we do register that Prim has just turned 12 as well, but somehow we don't fully connect the dots, not until the inciting opportunity. And that's the power of a dual inciting incident. The threat was right there from the beginning, we just didn't see it. The next strategic connection points are the moral and psychological complications, each putting pressure on its associated need. In the Hunger Games, the moral need is about what kind of person you choose to be in a system designed to dehumanize you. So the moral complication happens during the training evaluation. This is when each tribute gets to demonstrate their skills while the Capitol officials watch. But when Katniss steps forward, they're barely paying attention. She has a small moral choice to make here: comply or defy, and in that moment, she takes a stance. Now, the psychological complication occurs not too long after. Katniss' psychological need throughout is to stop mistaking emotional distance for strength. So when Peter confesses his love for her live on television, she's not exactly over the moon. If anything, she's furious because she suspects it's a strategy, a move to win sponsors. But what really rattles her is that she's been pulled into an emotional narrative that she didn't choose. In her book, it makes her look weak and vulnerable rather than strong and threatening. Her psychological need gets pressed in public, and she can do nothing but watch it unfold on TV. Now, earlier we discussed what the moral and psychological needs were for Pride and Prejudice and also for The Handmaid's Tale. I'm currently building full case studies on both to include in the book that I'm writing on the Storyteller's Method. Links in the description if you want to know when it's out. The third and final main connection point is the ultimate moral dilemma, which is the culmination, the turning point of your dual storyline. This is the moment your protagonist has no choice but to face the psychological wound that's been pressing on them throughout the entire story so that they can finally fulfill their psychological need and act on the moral need. In The Hunger Games, that moment arrives when Peeta offers to sacrifice himself so that Katniss can win and go home to her family. She's faced with an impossible choice: let someone she loves die so she can survive, or sacrifice herself for him, which means abandoning Prim and her mother, pretty much everything she's been fighting for. It's the ultimate moral dilemma of the story because there's no good outcome either way. And it's in facing that dilemma that your protagonist will have their ultimate aha moment and finally see the moral need of the story. If they act on it and they do the moral thing, then they complete a positive character arc. But if they don't, if they do the immoral thing knowing full well what the right choice was, they complete a negative character arc. Either way, their action leads to the resolution of your novel. The dual storyline works with any story structure, but if you want to learn how it works with the Storyteller's Method, you can start here.